Welcome. You're about to watch a rigorous reconstruction of a hard American truth, told without graphic images and grounded in verifiable records. Viewer discretion is advised for discussing. 1921. Tulsa, Oklahoma. In a booming oil city that sold itself as modern, a prosperous black district, known nationwide as Black Wall Street, was reduced to ash in hours. This is not rumor. It is a disturbing dossier of arson, forced detention, and property seizures, an episode long treated as unspeakable, effectively banned by polite omission and bureaucratic fog. Tonight, we open the files. We follow city minutes, insurance clauses, court filings, sworn statements, and survivor testimony. We will not show gore. We will show evidence. Stay with the record as it reveals a pattern: how a single allegation became a headline, how a headline became mobilization, how the language of order selected a side. By the end, you can judge whether Tulsa was a riot, a pogrom, or a meticulously minimized crime whose legacy still haunts the land. Before smoke wrote headlines across the sky, Greenwood moved to the rhythm of success. Barbers snapped capes at first light. Nurses stepped off night shifts. A pianist tested the dreamland's keys. A notary stamped deeds for homes newly paid down. O.W. Gurley's vision had matured into streets of enterprise. J.B. Stratford's hotel welcomed travelers with quiet confidence. Doctors kept ledgers. Teachers posted exam scores. Money circulated within the district attorney's caterers, mechanics, dressmakers, proof that black excellence could flourish without permission. That prosperity was polarizing. Jim Crow's unwritten code demanded modest dreams, not visible achievement. Editorial pages treated Greenwood like a paradox, admirable and to some intolerable. The district contradicted a story segregation told about what was natural. In that contradiction lay volatility. Police discretion bent with skin tone. Insurance fine print weighted with exclusions that would later read like traps. Headlines could promote a rumor to truth by noon, and once printed fear traveled faster than facts could walk. This was the fragile normal Sunday close laid out. Ledger books balancing, a choir rehearsing, and beneath it, a stockpile of grievance sanctioned by custom. The city did not need a secret meeting to produce catastrophe. It needed a programmed arrangement, elastic charges like vagrancy and disorder, rapid deputization, a press ready to amplify fear, and administrative tools to rename the aftermath, so compensation would wither. When a courthouse crowd gathered around an accusation, its details contested, then and now men with fresh badges moved as if to a plan that required no minutes and left few fingerprints. The paradox is macabre. The very visibility of black prosperity titles, inventories, cash on hand, made Greenwood both inspiring and vulnerable. Theaters, offices, and homes stood like ledgers in 3 dimensions. Once the spark arrived, someone only had to decide which pages to burn and which to keep for claims. Law, which should isolate the guilty and protect the rest, began to function as selection. Who would be disarmed? Which doors would be searched? Whose testimony would be doubted? Whose losses would be filed under terms riot disturbance that guaranteed denial? This is how a city can preserve its schedule while a neighborhood loses its future. If this history matters to you, stay as we unpack how law, media, and policy aligned to make Greenwood vulnerable, and how that alignment echoes today. Tell us where you're watching from, and whether your schools ever taught Tulsa 1921. If your family carries a memory of Greenwood, share what you can. No names required, so the record grows. Subscribe if you value evidence-based black history told without sensationalism, only documents memory and accountability. Greenwood did not rise in a vacuum, and it did not fall by accident. The United States had already engineered a scaffolding of exclusion, convict leasing, sharecropping traps, redlining precursors in banking practices, and layered statutes that made black prosperity a violation of etiquette, if not of code. In Oklahoma, new statehood brought constitutions and ordinances whose neutrality evaporated in enforcement. Vagrancy and disorderly conduct could be elastic nets. Policing was protection when the complainant was white. It became order when the defendant was black. Editorial pages helped. If rumors suggested danger, a paper could magnify it into a final warning. Courts rewarded discretion, the kind that sent black defendants to jail and white defendants home. Juries were peers to some and strangers to others. Insurance policies could exclude acts of riot, a word generous enough to be applied after the fact. City leaders learned the grammar. What you call an event determines who gets paid and who is left to sift ashes for heirlooms. This unspeakable alignment of institutions. Police deputized civilians, National Guard units that answered to local orders meant that in any sudden crisis, the state had the machinery to decide which neighborhood would be defended and which would be opened. None of this required a conspiracy in the cinematic sense. It required shared assumptions, written and unwritten, that black wealth was provisional and white fear was dispositive. By 1921, the disturbing precedent was everywhere. Lynchings framed as justice, law, and order, as a chorus drowning out testimony that didn't fit. So when a young black man was accused in an elevator details to be debated forever, the system was ready. Headline writers shaped the mood. Men with rifles assembled under badges knew that day. This is what programmed violence means. In a documentary sense, a community primed to supply bodies, weapons, and legal rationales at speed, then file the paperwork so the city could function tomorrow. The massacre would look spontaneous to those who benefited from calling it that. The files, if you read them, tell a steadier story. No curses drive this narrative, only choices. Yet in survivor accounts, there is a kind of American folk ominousness, dogs who would not cross a certain street the night before. Church mothers warning their sons not to be caught downtown after dusk. Fathers instructing daughters which alleys to use if rumors rose. The town had a way of seeing weather before the barometer caught it. Shopkeepers heard it in doorbells that rang too early too often. In the way uniformed men watched from corners where they had not stood before. Folklore is not proof, but it is data about feeling. In Greenwood, people described a taste in the air, the metallic edge that comes with heat lightning when editorials sharpened and crowds quoted them like scripture. There were whispered final warnings. Don't go alone. Not tonight. If they deputize boys, the boys will want to test the badge. If a rumor starts in print, the truth starts with a limp. These are not a cult in the supernatural sense. They are the oral calculus of people who have survived long enough to read danger from posture, tone, and silence. The morning of the spark, nobody knew which minute would fracture. But everyone knew how fragile law could be when fear was requested. That is the terror that makes Tulsa feel macabre, even in its calm pages, the sense that the script had been prepared by custom, waiting only for an opening cue. If there was a curse, it was the curse of American denial. The promise that this is not who we are right before doing exactly that. The elevator encounter? A scream, a stumble, a startled hand on a forearm. The fragment remains the fragment. What followed is clearer. By afternoon, rumor had been promoted to threat. By evening, armed white men gathered downtown. Some were formally deputized, others deputized by nod and wink. When black veterans walked to the courthouse to prevent a lynching, a measured, disciplined show of presence, they carried experience, not bravado. They'd worn uniforms for a country that asked much and returned little. In the press of voices, a shot cracked the night. Which rifle? Which hand? Eyewitnesses disagree as eyewitnesses will. But like a spark in a grain elevator, that single pressure on a trigger set a dust-dry system ablaze. Law is supposed to isolate the guilty and protect the rest. Instead, in minutes, law selected a side. Men newly pinned with badges absorbed the energy of the crowd. Some disarmed black citizens while leaving white men untouched. Trucks moved with certainty toward Greenwood's edge. The language of order, so orderly, made space for chaos in one direction only. Homes were marked. Businesses were searched. The verb betrays the plan's searching as a prelude to taking. Theaters, offices, boarding houses, professional suites, door after door were invaded in patterns that would later be defended as necessary given the emergency. Shots from the hills. Fires leaping block to block as if following pre-drawn lines. The night's gruesome choreography was not random. It reflected knowledge of who owned what and where. Think of a hotel lobby quiet hours before dawn. Then think of men storming it with torches and lists. Imagine the arithmetic of loss. A doctor's instruments melted, a jeweler's inventory. Pocketed account books charred into unreadable curls. Imagine a child's toy singed, lifted from ash the next day by hands that would never again be sure the city existed for them. When authorities arrive to save a city, they build perimeters around danger and ferry civilians to safety. When they arrive to pacify a population, they build perimeters around civilians and ferry danger through the gates. On that night, uniformed presence did not seal Greenwood for protection. It opened it. Witnesses watched trucks, ferrymen, and kerosene watch the geometry of streets become a funnel for flame. The sound most survivors remember is not only gunfire. It's wood behaving like dry paper. By morning, the sky over Tulsa carried a burnt ledger smell. Smoke wrote its own headlines. Families were marched, some to holding centers, some to the fairgrounds. The legal language would later lean on riot because riot makes both sides sound equal. The footage where it exists does not. The documents where they survived tell of arrests for protection that felt like prison and releases contingent on white employers' signatures. This is how you depopulate without a formal proclamation. In a nation where the word citizen is supposed to be a shield, paperwork became a gate. To pass it, you first had to accept the grammar of your erasure. If history breathed through witnesses, Tulsa tried to hold its breath. Nurses who triaged burns observed patterns accelerants on clothing wounds consistent with shots fired from elevated positions. Postal workers noted which routes were blocked first. A black teacher recorded the day's sequence in a school ledger margin. Those pages went missing when the building was cleaned. A photographer reportedly developed frames that later vanished, leaving only caption notes. A hotel clerk recognized faces among the search teams and wrote them in a notebook that was later misplaced. This is the portion many call banned testimony. Not because a federal seal stamped it, but because the city's working memory learned to reject it as destabilizing. Courts asked for corroboration that flames had consumed. Insurance adjusters requested proof that evidence destroyed was ever evidence at all. When a survivor presented charred deeds, an office cited a clause. When a claim named a deputy, the file asked for a badge number hard to supply, when badges had been handed out and taken back in one long night. Erasure isn't only burning paper, it's starving truth of oxygen. You budget an investigation like a tight ledger. You grant standing to those with the right titles. You demand specificity from those whose homes are now rubble. Bring the cereals, says the form to a man whose tools were stolen in the fire. Provide witnesses, says the file to a woman whose neighbors were interned at the fairgrounds. The testimony exists scattered in letters, in church minutes, in interviews taken decades later, in photographs stored in attics. But the official appetite for that testimony was small. Some say a classified album still exists, a sequence of photographs taken by a white shop owner before the worst, and again after annotated with names. Others say an overseer's journal lists which properties were targeted and by whom. Whether or not these artifacts ever surface the logic of their rumored existence tells us something people believe records were kept because the violence itself was systematic. And systematic crimes keep books, if not for law, then for loot. Here's what we know without rumor. Greenwood's population was disarmed under color of law. Its businesses were inspected under the pretext of security and then burned. Its residents were detained in facilities they had not chosen. The city's officials preferred labels that minimized accountability. And when survivors later sought damages, they entered a maze of terms: riot, insurrection, public disturbance, that redirected compensation to avoid. What do you call testimony denied, room at the table banned is a strong word. But if you refuse to file it, accept it, cite it functionally, you have banned it. That is why survivors turn to oral history, to churches and fraternal lodges, to kitchen table archives. When the city would not hold the memory, the neighborhood did. When the neighborhood was scattered, memory traveled in boxes and in prayer. This is the part that tempts the sensational. We refuse it. We will name harm without showing it. The gruesome revelation is bureaucratic families reduced to lists, homes converted to lots, savings translated into numbers that didn't add up when claims were filed. Coroners may have undercounted. Death certificates can fail to materialize when a body's fate is a rumor balanced on smoke. Mass graves are not metaphors. Where records are thin, soil becomes an archive. Decades later, searches and surveys would probe ground where witnesses pointed long ago. The terror in Tulsa is not only that people died, it's that their precise number could be treated as negotiable. A lesser count cools liability. A higher one warms memory into action. The city's comfort lay in treating the truth like a thermostat. Consider the business books. An inventory of a pharmacy, tonics, bandages, instruments, melted into a ledger of loss due to riot. Consider a school's register that misses a week without explanation. Consider a church's communion set warped in storage, now presented on anniversaries as proof. Evidence you can touch, warped silver scorched hymnals, endures longer than a headline because it refuses to be both sides. Some reported planes, private aircraft circling. Whether to spot, to intimidate, to drop incendiaries, the accounts vary. What matters in the documentary record is that Greenwood burned comprehensively and quickly in multiple sectors, a pattern consistent with coordinated arson. If aviation was present, it was another way the modern city announced its power. If it was not, the effect was the same: neighborhoods ignited as if from above. The tally of the climax looks like a bank statement. With anger in the margins, blocks erased, professionals displaced, clinics ruined, theaters destroyed, libraries of photographs gone. The macabre truth is not a single image. It is the administrative neatness with which a city can tolerate ruin and then resume schedule. Garbage collected, streetcars ran, dockets filled. For Greenwood families, the clock did not resume. It restarted them at zero. Why does a story like this get treated as erased? Start with motive. Economic property changed hands. Rebuilding required permits and approvals controlled by the same apparatus that failed to protect. A district with prime adjacency to rail and downtown commerce represented potential profit if rezoned, redeveloped, or simply not rebuilt quickly enough for owners to return. Political no leader wants a national headline of city complicity. Minimizing becomes survival. Cultural, the American myth requires that horrors be framed as anomalies. A pogrom is a foreign word. A riot is domestic. Next mechanism. Language, call it civil disturbance, and you've already shifted blame. Documentation, lose files, restrict access, apply. Inconsistent standards of proof. Insurance, enforce exclusions retroactively or interpret liberally. Courts dismiss suits for timeliness or standing. Media run commemorations without addressing liability. Valorize reconciliation over restitution. Education, omit the event from textbooks, relegate it to a sidebar. Repetition is the final motive. If a system learns that violence can be absorbed administratively, it will remember the lesson. That's why accounts speak of how it keeps repeating itself in new forms: urban renewal displacing quietly, highways slicing through minority neighborhoods, Emergency powers deployed asymmetrically. Erasure is an art form with American characteristics. Amicable language, patient paperwork, and the confidence that time will sand down edges until only a moral "we must heal" remains unmoored from repair. None of this denies individual bravery. White neighbors sheltered black families. Some officers defied orders. Nurses treated without asking who was at fault. Those lights matter. But policy does not balance by anecdote. If the machinery runs a few brave hands, cannot stop the factory. Only public will law and money can. Walk Greenwood today, and you can read absence as plainly as signage. New buildings rise where photos show avenues of enterprise. Markers bear names that once appeared on shop fronts and hospital doors. Commemorations help. But the haunting is economic. Lost compounding wealth doesn't return with a plaque. A bank that should have had 3 generations of deposits now has a story instead. Families whose grandparents would have paid for college with property income faced rental markets instead. The legal afterlife of 1921 is a field of failed suits, partial acknowledgments, and timelines that ask survivors to outlast city calendars. Decades later, we still debate the count, the intent, the classification. Survivors speak. Children of survivors measure what wasn't inherited. Researchers probe ground politely fenced. Memory institutions do excellent work within constraints. Constraints persist. There is progress curricula that finally mention the event museums that hold photographs with reverence. But recognition is not restitution. What is the present warning? That respectable language can still insulate harm. That terms like redevelopment, public safety, and order can be arranged innocently into patterns that remove people. That when the next emergency arrives, health crisis, protest, disaster, official discretion will look for the path of least resistance. We honor Greenwood by training our eyes to see pattern, not merely episode. Chapter 5.2. Final statement and haunting question, 650 words. We have resisted spectacle and chosen the record. The banned truth is not a gore photo. It is the civic habit that made gore possible. The macabre isn't only what fire did to walls. It is what silence did to paper. If the event is unspeakable, it is because speaking requires an economy of attention we have not consistently paid. What then is our work? Teach this accurately. Demand archives be opened and properly funded. Support scholars and community historians. Insist that reparative policy be discussed with the same seriousness as memorial design. And where the ground still holds unanswered questions, let science proceed with reverence, transparency, and community consent. A final question, then one that still haunts the land. If we can finally call Tulsa by its true name, will we also call the ledger by its truer numbers? Or will we once more let the clock declare victory over memory?